Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming during this second period of your day. Today, the Department of English and the Interpreting and Translation Program would like to warmly welcome the world-renowned Finnish scholar and translator of children's literature, Riitta Oittinen. Thank you. Professor Oittinen taught at the universities of Tampere and Helsinki in Finland. In addition, she is an extraordinary artist. That is her art up here on the screen. She herself is an artist. And she's also a prolific academic with over 200 publications to her name. I have just 2 of them here about the translation of children's literature. Her work is not limited to academic writing and translation, however. She is also a talented artist in her own right, and she has arranged over 50 art exhibitions worldwide. Finally, in 2019, the Children's Literature Association presented Riitta Oittinen with the International Anne Devereaux Jordan Award as, quote, artist, scholar, teacher, and mentor. The prize is given once a year to one scholar in the world in recognition of scholarship and service, which have made lasting contributions to the field of children's literature. Today, she will share her insights about the translation of children's literature in her talk titled Every Telling is a Retelling. There will be some time at the end of her talk today to ask questions. So be sure to note down any questions you have while she's speaking, and at the end, we'll give you a chance to ask questions directly. Okay? So, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Riitta Oittinen to Kobe College today. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
It's so lovely to be here. I come from Finland and I asked my husband what's the weather like, and then he sent me pictures with lots of trees, with lots of snow on the trees, and so we have snow in Finland already. So back to the topic, and thank you so much for your lovely interpretation. I'd like to say, well, dear audience, dear students, dear scholars, dear friends, I bring you warm greetings from School Finland, as I said, and so we have snow in Finland. I skip that. Our topic for our meeting is different ways of translation. And I will take a short look into the past, and I will mainly concentrate on the present day and the glimpse of tomorrow too. The main issues are Roman Jakobsson's division into different types of translation. And then we will move to Mihail Bachtin's thinking about dialogics, carnival, and heteroglossia. Here it is good to remember, I always want to mention that Mihail Bachtin was by the Russian philosopher also a dissident, unfortunately. And of course we will not forget Lewis Carroll, and he's among my very best friends. So now we will discuss different ways of translation and reading Carroll's books. So first you can see my image about the Alice. Sorry. So here you can see my Alice, and she's young-faced, worried and happy at the same time. And this is how Alice depicts herself, that she's changing all the time, and she is always more than one. In my presentation today, I will discuss different ways of time and types of translation in the light of Lewis Carroll's stories about Alice. We will start from almost the very beginning, that is, with Roman Jakobsson's definition and division, translation into intralingual, interlingual, and intercentric. I will come back to that later. Then I will add one more way to the list, which is individual translation. I will also tell a little bit of my early experiences as a translation scholar. Suomen varsin. Not that aesthetic, but I need it. Okay. So at the background of my presentation, there are many texts I have written, but today especially two of my recent book chapters. First of all, The Many Faces of Alice in Carnival, from intersemiotic to individual translation. It is in book The Art of Translation in light of Bachtin's reaccentuation, and it was edited by Slav Grachev and Margarita Marinova, and I was very proud to be invited as a writer to this volume. It's very interesting, and I strongly suggest it for you to read. And then the other text at my background is Translating the Verbal and the Visual for a Child, Perspectives and Dialogues. And it was edited by Mihan Gorov and Jose Diaz-Sintas. This book is just about forthcoming. Probably it has come out already in 2024. So in my background there are also my Translating for Children from 2000 and Translating Picture Books reversing the verbal, the visual and the oral for a child audience. And it appeared in 2018. So now I will deal a little bit of with today and yesterday, where we have come from and where we are going to. So in most of my texts, articles, book chapters, illustrations, animations, exhibitions and books, I have discussed such topics as situation and equivalence, as well as reader's understanding and performance. I have also dealt with a child image and adult authority. At the background there are my views about translating the verbal and the visual for a child, readers, and translating in a dialogic situation that is depicted by the Russian philosopher Mihail Bakhtin that I just mentioned. So in addition, one important reason for my interest in visuality and individuality is that I'm an artist myself, that was already mentioned. So it has been interesting to change from one role to another, from authorship to artistship to scholarship of translation and back again. So during my career, I have constantly moved between these sometimes quite different roles. Ever since I started my scholarly life, I have been fascinated by Lewis Carroll's stories of Alice. By the way, how many of you know or has read Lewis Carroll's Alice? Okay? Some? So it's something worthwhile reading. So ever since I started my scholarly life, I have been fascinated by Lewis Carroll's stories of Alice. As I said, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the first Alice book, and the second Alice book, Through the Looking Glass and the Alice Found There. And this part began in the early years of my university studies, and the path still shows in my rooms. So I have been writing about Bachtin maybe 30 odd years. Ever since, for example, in the years 2021 and 22, I arranged in Finland 2 big art exhibitions on the basis of my full illustrations of Carroll's 2 stories of Alice. Along with my 175 images at my background, it's not easy to let go. So here I go again with my research on Carroll's work, and today also as an illustrator of Carroll's 2 Alice stories. So it may be that I go on till I'm engraved. So once in a while, I have arranged exhibitions about my Carroll illustrations, also outside Finland, Brazil, Greece, and so on. and many others. Yet I'm very much looking forward to forthcoming exhibitions at your university, maybe later. And neither my images nor myself have ever been to Japan before, and I've been here for 4 weeks now, and I just love it. So I will return, probably. So, as you know, in addition to my teaching and lecturing, they will also be exposing my full Alice illustrations. There's also behind, there's a brand new book manuscript, The Fox, the Owl and the Red Wall. And we'll see what happens to that book in the future. And I have co-written several texts as stories and also scientific texts with Elisa Pitkasalo, and I have illustrated the book, The Fox, the Owl and the Red Wall. However, before moving any further, we will start from almost the very beginning of translation studies. We will discuss Roman Jakobsson's quite well-known categorization from as early as 1959. According to Jakobsson, translation can be divided into subtitles such as intralingual, interlingual, and intersemitic translation. Very unaesthetic. So here time. So about intralingual translation, it concerns situations where a verbal text is transformed into a new version using the properties of the same natural language. It may be, for example, such as language for people with dyslexia. In other words, interlingual translation may be a story retold in an easier way. Then there's interlingual translation, and it is understood as so-called translation proper. A verbal text in one language is interpreted into another natural language, such as from Japanese into Finnish. As an example, I can mention the different translations of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland that we will deal a bit later. Translating from one natural language into another is how we most often understand translation. Then there is intersemiotic translation. That concerns transferring verbal contents into some other non-verbal sign systems, for example, into the visual, or vice versa. So when a text is illustrated, for example. As to the creation process of a picture book, the actual authoring and illustration, it can be categorized as intersemiotic translation, because there are at least two sign systems involved, the verbal and the visual, or one language into another. So the interaction of words and images is reciprocal and does not take place into one direction only. So along with the writing and illustrating process, the images and the story in words interact. And there is also intervisual translation, that is creating images on the basis of images translating into other images, such as a picture book into comics, or re-illustrating an already illustrated text. For example, I have created an illustration of Carol's first story of Alice using Carol's very first published in his lifetime story, his story of Alice that he has illustrated by himself. You will see some examples of that later. Before we move any further, there is one important item to be explained, and that is a picture book. Here's my definition based on some other definitions. That's how I see a picture book. Picture books are often created for children and for real-life situations. These references are included in the visual content, and they build the meaning of images with other visual elements, such as colors, chiaroscuro, from light to darkness, and perspective. All meaning-making elements must be taken into consideration in the intersemiotic translation process. When we think of the creation process of a picture book, the words and images are in continuous movement. The authors modify the plot, the dialogue and the text all together, and these changes are incorporated in the illustrations, where every line, every graphic element carries meanings. In this way, the intersemiotic translation process can be described as continuous interaction between the verbal and the visual. As I promised, I will now take a very short look back in time, because I want to explain about things about censorship. And I'm using myself as a guinea pig. So now we are in the 1980s and 1990s. In the 1980s, I was a young enthusiast of translating for children and took my beginner steps at the Tampere University in Finland. So I had a strong will to look deeper into children's literature in translation and illustration. One day, I was reading through books and came across a text by the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin, and that was a revelation to me. The more I read, the more I was fascinated by his views about dialogue, heterogosia, and carnival. However, my way toward the PhD was sometimes a very bumpy road. It is no wonder, as my dissertation was the very first in translation studies in Finland and probably in translation studies in the entire world. I am not quite sure about that, but I was among the first ones. So, this concerns especially translating for children, with a special attention to the verbal, visual, and the child reader. Regardless of the harsh tones of some conversations, the lion's share of the discussions surely influenced my later scholarly life, mostly in a positive sense. Yet the years 1987 and 1989, when I finished my master's and licentiate degrees, it certainly paved my way toward finishing my doctorate in 1993 and publishing the thesis I Am Other on the dialectics of translating for children as a book the same year. So I sometimes heard very critical comments on my way toward being a translation scholar, and a scholar of children's literature and translation in particular. In 1987, when as a young student I was handling my master's thesis, the first comments were about illustration in the context of translation studies. Well, let's move on. Sorry about that. So, I heard critical comments on my way towards being a translation scholar and a scholar of children's literature in translation in particular. In 1987, when as a young student I was handling in my master's thesis, the first comments were about illustration in the context of translation studies. There was an elder colleague that, having taken a quick glance at my thesis, he claimed that translation only concerns verbal texts, and that's it. No images were allowed, and I was heard, you can never translate texts or words into images, and that my thesis would never pass. There's one way of censoring a translation scholar. And yet my thesis did pass without any difficulties, and I'm still on the same road as a translation scholar. So translation is not only about words, but it's much wider thing to do. Now we'll move a little bit in time. There's another occasion about why I have been criticized because of my attention to images and the visual in translation. So it was the year 1991, and the International Research Society of Children's Literature, IRSCL, arranged a congress in Paris under the title The Applications of Contemporary Literary and Cultural Theory to Children's Literature. In this conference, I gave my very first international presentation for a large audience. There must be 500 people. And the Congress was titled, also given the title of The Dialogic Nature of Translation, I mean my work, Response of the Child Reader. And the place was packed full, and there were many listeners. So in my discussion, when I was giving the presentation, I dealt with translating for children and made a remark about translation always being different from its original. I claim that so-called sameness is an illusion and it does not exist. I applied Bachtin's views about dialogics and words always being born in some conversations that are influenced by their participators and their views about life, literature, and children. After my presentation, it was my first one ever, after my presentation, I believed that I had made my point and was looking forward to an interesting discussion. However, my presentation aroused a hectic conversation and the atmosphere was quite hostile. One of my colleagues even commented that Bachtin has nothing to do with children's literature, nor its translation. Then one of the elder scholars stood up and accused me of, I can still remember the words, destroying international children's literature. And I had just given my very first presentation in English for a huge audience. I was young, and what happened was that I was so devastated that I felt tears falling on my cheeks. I was angry, but I was also ashamed. However, all of a sudden, I saw this very lady who had criticized me so hard. I saw this very lady standing in front of me and inviting me for a cup of coffee. This story really has a happy end, and we became friends, even though we never agreed about the matter for our dispute. So among the most critical scholars, criticizing me, was the Swede Riitta Klingberg, one of the forerunners in children's literature, who stressed the importance of translators producing texts that are close enough to their originals. According to Klingberg, translators should not change anything, but rather be faithful to whatever there is in the original text. That is, as Klingberg mentioned, that is the normal meaning of words in translation. So this story has and has not a happy end. Klingberg and I exchanged some letters, yet in the end he wrote that my research was simply, I quote, my research was simply a childish attempt to draw conclusions on false pretenses. Oh my God! So you can imagine how I felt as I was just finishing my PhD, and thereafter we never exchanged messages, which I do regret today, and Klingberg has died a long time ago. I'm very sorry about that we didn't discuss things further. So as I mentioned, in 1993 I finished my PhD, and I went on with my research about translating for children and for child audiences, and I applied Bahtin's philosophy to translation studies. I also went on with my ponderings on translating Lewis Carroll's stories of Alice. Yes, I had learned something. I realized that in the end I should be wise enough to pick up the best of the comments given to me, even the critical ones. With time, I practiced arguing and defending my views and listening to the comments by other scholars with an attentive ear. It's always worthwhile listening to what other scholars say and then decide what to think. So gradually my road became smoother. With time, I have found my way, and I'm here today, which is simply wonderful. After finishing my PhD, I went on with my research, and at that point, I concentrated on the role of a child audience. For that purpose, I applied Bahtin's philosophy as well as Lewis Carroll's stories of Alice. But now we will concentrate on translating the verbal and the visual in picture books, using Mihail Bahtin's theories of dialogics, carnival, and heteroglossia. I've drawn this image for you. Okay, sorry about that. Here we are. So I have depicted dialogics as there are three devils that are keeping the picture together, because dialogics is all over and it can never be separated from anything else. And then if we move further, there's heteroglossia, and it means that in a situation, if one thing is altered, a picture or even a word, it has an influence on how we understand the whole text. And then we have carnival, and carnival is an interesting thing altogether, but it means that when the original text is difficult or hard to figure out, then you may use carnivalistic methods. But carnival, of course, also means that the original text is not the one or the basis for translation, but it is also, I have another example of that, let's move further. But in the middle, there's something important. It is intervisual translation, and it means that translator translates both the verbal and the visual, and the intervisual means that they both have an influence on how we understand texts. So, all this is dialogic interaction. So there is no word, no image as such, but there is always a human being experiencing as the word, as a certain experiencing the word as a certain kind of a word. The presence of the human being totally changes the thing to be understood. There's always the eye that has a unique angle of looking at things and texts. In other words, dialogue, heteroglossia, and carnival are the main ideas of Bahtin's philosophy. As he points out, a dialogue is never absolute. It's never authoritarian. Every time the I and the you meet, they interact and give rise to new meanings. Like me here talking to you and you responding on a mine. Bahtin depicts this constant interaction as dialogic and underlies the core of a word. It is never as such, but it's always in relation to other words. Dialogue takes place between two or more persons, but also inside one person, when she or he is conversing with her or himself, for example, reading books she or he has read in the past as a child. To express it differently, dialogue may be understood as a meeting place for different authors, illustrators, readers, context, the past, the present, and the future. There are also many factors that are changing all the time. This situation may be depicted through heteroglossia, which is closely related to dialogue. It is the base condition governing the meanings in any utterance. Miha Horkvist has explained this a little bit. He writes, at any given time, in any given place, there will be a set of conditions, social, historical, methodological, physiological, that will ensure that the word uttered in that place and at that time will have a meaning that is different than you could have under any other conditions. So we have a word, and a word has a context, and the context has an influence on how we understand the word. So Bakhtin depicts this constant interaction as dialogic and underlines the core of a word. As I said, it is never as such, but it is always in relation to other words. Dialogue takes place between two or more persons, but also inside one person when this one person, she or he, is conversing with her or himself. For example, reading books she has read in the past as a child. So to express it differently, dialogue may be understood as a meeting place for different authors, illustrators, readers, context, the past, the present, the future. There are so many factors changing all the time, and this situation may be depicted through heteroglossia. It is closely related to dialogue. It is the base condition governing the meanings in any utterance. And again, Michael Hall is right. At any given time, in any given place, there will be a set of conditions, social, historical, methodological, physiological, and so on. And they will ensure that you will utter in that place at that time will have a meaning that is different from what it could have under any conditions. So this is how we have Bakhtin depicts heteroglossia. In this way, things such as images are understood in different ways, in different situations. If we, for example, change the order of images in a book, their meaning changes. If we translate and change the words into other words in some other language, the whole understanding of the situation changes. I have here one example of the Van Gogh's paintings. And it's me. Sorry. So where was I? Yes, about John Berger and about Vincent van Gogh. Do you recognize this painting? Good. So when we look at this picture, that is Winfield with crows, it is heartbreakingly beautiful. I love the picture, and I started crying when I saw it in a museum. So Winfield with crows, the official information. And then if we change the text into something else, if we add something, this is the last picture Van Gogh painted before he kills himself. And now we look at this picture with the crows over the fields in a different way. we may think that the yellow fields are like mature growth or something like that, and then these black crows start being as if they were messengers of death. And then someone has said that Vincent van Gogh had come into different ideas and drawn conclusions, and said that, well, he just killed himself after that. But if we know that he was only something like 30 years of age, he certainly wasn't ripe years. He was a pretty young man, but he was very unlucky in love. So dialogue, heterodoxia and carnival are the main ideas of Bakhtin's philosophy, as I said a while ago. So as he points out, the dialogue is never absolute, never authoritarian. Every time the I and the you meet, like in translation, they interact and give way to new meanings. Like me here, talking to you, and you responding on your minds, in your minds anyways. Bakhtin depicts this constant interaction as dialogic and underlines the core of a word. As I said earlier, it is never as such, but is always in relation to other words. Dialogue takes place between two or more persons, but it also may happen inside one person, when the person is conversing with himself or herself. For example, reading books she or he has read in the past as a child. As I was pretty young when I read Carol's stories of Alice. So we could express it differently and say that dialogue may be understood as a meeting place for different authors, illustrators, readers, the past, the present, and the future. Michael Howard writes, at any given time, in any given place, there will be a set of conditions, social, historical, meteorological, physiological, that will ensure that the word uttered in that place and at that time will have a meaning different than it would under any other conditions. So this is how Bakhtin depicts heterodoxia. In this way, things such as images are understood in different ways in different situations. If we, for example, change the order of images in a book, their meaning changes. If we translate and change the words into something else, so into new words and images, the whole understanding changes. I have another example, and this is something we saw right now, so I won't have it. We'll go to the example by Vincent van Gogh, and after that, our ways of thinking are again, when thinking about Vincent van Gogh, are again turned upside down as we realize that he was only 37 years of age, a young man, who certainly was not a ripe field to be harvested. So all understanding is heterodox. It means that if we change one tiny detail in a text, translation, illustration, the whole situation of understanding the text changes. So all understanding is heterodox. When we are reading a story, if a single image, a single word, a single character, or a single person reading or hearing or seeing changes, everything changes and becomes new. In even one tiny part of the text changes, the whole situation changes. In the Bachtinian sense, this means that nothing is or will ever be entirely understood, because every situation of understanding is different. Time has passed, literatures, people have changed. In fact, everything is in motion, and nothing stops to be fully understood. As Stanley Fish has pointed out, we are never not in a situation. We are always in a situation. I have one more example here. Barefooting guys. This is from my illustration of Alice's adventures. So, in this situation that we see, Alice has just been swimming in the pool of tears, and the characters are quite unpleasant. They scream and they show ugly faces. There are some sad faces too, but the general atmosphere is frightening. And it's really awful that Alice finds herself in this kind of a situation. So if we again add one sentence to go with the same image, the whole way of understanding the situation turns upside down. If we, let's see if I have here. Okay, if we add to the image a sentence, what is ridiculous cannot be dangerous. So this sentence has an influence on how we see the picture. It is not that dangerous anymore, but it has become more ridiculous, something to laugh at. So dialogue is also an issue of power and carnival. Executing power or not having the power. Following Bachtin's line of thinking, I have depicted translation as reading and writing through constant human understanding. And as I said, nothing is as such. Everything is in relation to everything else. So instead of mimicking the original, translating may be seen as a cannibalistic action, where the translator takes the text close to her himself and looks fearlessly at the original. In this way, translation becomes live, continuous discussion, human speech to another human. In other words, when making choices, the translator or illustrator may adopt a cannibalistic viewpoint, where the interpretations of stories can be depicted using the crown metaphor. Let's check. Oh, here it is. So that's actually Alice, who has lost her crown of interpretation. So according to Bachtin, every time a new reader reads a story, she or he takes the crown of interpretation for her himself, only to abdicate the crown afterwards and let it pass on to the following head. So there's no one who has the final view or idea of any text, because all understanding changes all the time. So symbolically in this situation, the carnival is an ephemeral ritual of constant mock crownings and simultaneous subsequent decrownings of the carnival queen or king. In this situation, the translator willingly hands the crown to the future readers of the text, and the understanding of text goes on and changes all the time. So the truth is always someplace else, and it cannot be owned by anyone, but it is in a constant movement. So I have written, yes, in Julia's Bayer, this means creating a new, different version in the targeted verbal and or visual language. This strategy certainly celebrates the change in translation, a new version that does not repeat what is said in the original language. Well, all this has an influence on how texts are translated, dialogized, cannibalized, and so on. It may be seen in a different light in different situations of rewriting text and images. So in any act of translation or illustration, there is some kind of adaptation, transformation, domestication, and foreignization, which all involve time, society, and power, as well as cultures and norms. As I comment in Kratseva Marinova, in cannibalized storytelling, new ways of communication always bring about new ways of speaking and expressing ideas. Let's see if I find the following. Okay. Though they denote the skill to go overboard, leave the tracks of the everyday life. To put it differently, a cannibalistic word and word are but dialogic, also paradoxical, conflicting, and certainly benevolent. As Hawkins writes, there is no such thing as a monologue. Behind every human utterance, there are discussions between human beings. In their research on Bachtin's dialogics, Morrison and Emerson use the term surprisingness, which means a real change. In this constellation of dialogics and carnivalism, people play with terror of the original text, and they defeat the fear by laughing at it. What is ridiculous cannot be dangerous. So in this situation, the terrifying original becomes a kind of a comic monster. You can take it close by, you're not afraid of it anymore. In cannibalistic translation, the grotesque could be also bodily, universal, and dialogic. So at the very end, before I say thank you, arigato gozaimasu, you can see 3 examples of my individual translations of Carol's very first images. Well, on the left-hand side, you can see Carol's depiction of Alice at the very beginning of the book, and on the right-hand side, there's my image depicting about the same situation, because in the story, Alice is, whenever Alice tries something, tastes something, the whole landscape changes and Alice either grows or gets smaller. And when we look at the picture on the left-hand side by Carol himself illustrated the original Alice, and this is from that illustration. So there's Alice wondering whether she should drink or not to drink, because if she drinks something or eats something, terrible things may happen or not. And on the right-hand side, you can see my Alice, who is pondering with a piece of mushroom in her hands, to try or not to try, to eat or not to eat. Then I have another example about the Carol's version and my version. On the right-hand side, you can see Carol's version. There is a caterpillar who has a long pipe that is tasting, burning, whatever, and he's sitting on this mushroom, and Alice is, you can only see her hands and dress, but Alice is certainly much smaller, and so it is an impossible situation. And in my image on the left-hand side, you can see the same caterpillar on top of a big mushroom, and then if you look at the bottom, very somewhere here, very tiny Alice is trying to cope with the situation, and she's small again. And then there are also examples. This is my interpretation of one of Carol's own illustration. There's the little girl Alice, and she's in a house or in a box, and she can't move, and she cannot break the house. In my version, I wanted to make Alice stronger. She's wearing the house like a dress or a coat, and she's running free, and she's not afraid of anything. And all the trees and everything go overboard, and Alice seems very happy compared with Carol's. Carol's illustration is very interesting. So if you start with Alice, reading Alice, so it is something that is worthwhile doing it. So I'm just about finished right now, and thank you for your attention. It was really lovely to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So she has very kindly offered to answer questions afterwards. I think there were probably some new ideas here, ideas that we aren't usually talking about in my translation classes. Perhaps some new vocabulary for some of us, such as heteroglossia or carnivalistic. So we had some new ideas and some new vocabulary that came up today in the presentation. So if you have questions, now is the perfect time to ask Professor Oittinen. Does anyone have anything?
Yeah, as shy as fish. Same situation.
It's so quiet. And there are so
How do
many
you
questions.
feel about the idea that a text to be translated or image to be translated is never the same as the original? Does it feel uncomfortable? Maybe yes. Because we are so used to the idea that the translation is the same as its original, and it isn't.
I thought it was really interesting that you brought the discussion of illustration into this talk about translation, because it reminded me of Japanese manga. Actually, when Japanese manga were first translated to English in the 1980s, and French actually too, the manga was, can you hand me the book? Sorry, one of your books would be fine, thank you. So the manga was actually, as we know, Japanese manga is read from this side, and we flip the pages this way, but they flipped it over and they printed the pages so the mihiraki looks correct when read from left to right. So they flipped the picture, the image on every page, which means that all of the characters suddenly became left-handed, and you know, it actually, they thought it's not a big deal, right? They thought it's acceptable to do that because it's no change, but actually it's an enormous change. So it was much more than just the translation of the dialogue, but also the translation of the images. And that's what I thought of when I heard you talking about the different illustrations for the same text. Yeah.
It often happens that it is also interesting if change the places of pictures. It also has an influence on what you read first, has an influence on what you read later, or see first, see later. But it was really, this is a very agonizing picture. Kind of, I feel so sorry for Alice, but she is kind of submitted, and she has given up, so she's just there in the box. And I wanted to draw Alice, strong, laughing, happy, and wearing the house, but it's like a coat, so she can take it off. And of course, Finnish landscape, lots of fir trees.
I think when Alice in Wonderland and Look Through the Looking Glass were written, children were seen as miniature adults. So it was common to portray them as sort of a miniature adult and not expressing the sort of natural joy of being a child and what would a child actually be feeling in that situation. So our perspective has changed in the last 150 years, thank goodness. Yeah. どうですか? Any other questions? はい。はい。
日本語でもいいですか?
Okay.
日本みたいにオノマトペア英語に翻訳するときに翻訳しにくいアイルランド語ってありますか?
フィンランド語に翻訳するときに。Okay, she just brought up the topic of onomatopoeia, our sound words. And this is a very big part of the Japanese language. It makes up a great deal of the new words that are added to Japanese every year. But it presents a big problem in translation. Actually, you can speak to this quite well. Professor Oittinen was accompanied by Sasaki Sensei. She's from Seisen University. She actually wrote an article about onomatopoeia for this book. But she's wondering if there are similar challenges translating into Finnish with onomatopoeia in particular.
I think yes.
There are no equivalents sometimes, or
yeah, because the whole story is full of poetic words and playing with words. So it comes from Carroll himself. But John Tenniel has illustrated after Carroll's own illustration. John Tenniel illustrated the story afterwards, and he has been considered as the father of the illustration of Alice. And people have been very, very careful and even scared of touching anything that John Tenniel has created. His creations, they're beautiful. The whole illustrations of the first and second Alice, they're really beautiful. But then again, at some point, I think that they are kind of depict the time, of course, the time when the story appeared for the first time as a full story. And it is interesting to think about what happens in translation, or when a story is re-illustrated. So,
when a story is re-illustrated or retranslated, depending on the time period, what is that important? If we have a good translation of a piece of literature, why do we need to retranslate it?
Well, because every translation is different, and time always influences translations. So I think John Tenniel's illustrations are marvelous. They're beautifully drawn, very interesting, but they to a great deal depict the time and the culture and British culture at that certain time. And so I would say that translation is never the same as its original. And this is what I was censored. I was not allowed to say that because it's wrong.
But I think these days that idea is much more accepted in the world of translation. Yeah, every translation depends on the translator, right?
Can I weigh in?
Yes, please.
I don't want to take up students' time, but since they seem awfully quiet, so I might jump in and start talking. Now, first of all, thank you very much for your speech, and I deeply resonated with what you've just said. You know, that no translation is exactly the same as the original. I 100% agree with that statement. But here's my carnivalistic comment about Christian Bibles.
Okay.
Right, with those old school translation theorists or scholars, they come from the background of maybe biblical translation.
Yeah.
And because
Like
within that,
yeah,
right, the
yeah.
Christian culture based on their, I don't know, their agenda, their societal needs and cultural needs and religious needs, the original and a translation must be equal, right? So that's where the idea of equivalence comes from. And to me, that is a silly way of thinking because all the languages are different. Not
And
only
time passes.
Exactly.
Time passes and cultures pass and so
Right,
on
everything
and change all the
changes,
time.
right? So like you said, you know, borrowing from Bahotin's idea that we live in this very polyphonic world where everybody's got a different opinion about one thing, and but then so it's the irony of this whole situation is because our world is so polyphonic. People like you and me saying, hey, translation is just a retelling, it's a paraphrase, it's never the same. Does it even have to be the same with the original? And then there are other groups of people who cannot accept that idea. It has to be the same, it has to be equal, otherwise it's never translation. What do you say to these people who have that type of voice? I mean, what is the dialogue we can have with them?
Seriously wrong.
Right?
Well, it is also so that when we have old translations, old illustrations, that have been at a part of their time and place and so on, and when we reread the old translations, it also happens, the same thing happens, that the old translations seem very different because time has passed, people have passed and so on. And but it was devastating. I still remember Jörgen's point when he said that I have drawn wrong conclusions and based my understanding on wrong views. And but I think that has pretty much changed in translation studies nowadays. But I still feel like what's the word? Heretic? Heresy.
Heresy.
Yeah, heresy. Yeah, I feel like being in heresy in somehow when I speak about that because it was January. I was in Poland and there was this man who stood up and said that that's wrong, you can't say that about translation studies. Here I am.
Much more accepted these days. I think your point of view is much more embraced. Devastated to hear you talk about another scholar who brought you to tears after your.
This is a job of scholars bringing others to tears. This is what we do daily.
I think about the situation. I have never before given any presentation in English, and then I was pretty young, maybe your age or a bit older maybe, and I didn't have any experience about congresses and conferences, and I had never talked to this large audience, and no wonder I was all in tears. I started crying in front of those huge crowd of people, and then came this wonderful lady, Carmen Bravo Villasante. I will remember her forever, she's dead now, but she came and invited me for a cup of coffee. It was unbelievable because she was so grand. And so I think we became friends in the end, and I think we never agreed about translation. That's another story.
That's okay. That's okay. That's all part of what we call the academic conversation, right? That's when we talk about attending this kind of presentation or presenting your own work in the Soto no Hapiokai. That's all part of the academic conversation. Hopefully, the goal is not to make anyone cry, but to actually have a conversation and present different ideas, because not everyone has the same idea about translation, and translation has changed a lot over the years. ideas about translation and attitudes, as you mentioned, especially Bible translation, has changed quite a lot over the
At
years.
that point, though, I have a bit of information to share. Alice used to be called Aiko in Japanese translation.
Yeah.
Right. So in the past, like 150 years ago, we were like domesticating everything,
Yeah.
changing characters' names so that the readership, local readership, can relate to.
Yeah.
So they all sounded like Japanese, and the story somehow, started sounding like it took place in Japan, right? But, but then again, nowadays we never, ever do that. If a character's name is Alice in a story, we call her Alice. If he's John, then we call him John, instead of changing it into some Japanese sounding name. So, like, world at large, from my viewpoint where I stand, seem to be moving away from domesticating all translation and more for foreignizing everything. For instance, all the sushi, fish and sushi. I, as an interpreter, used to have to interpret everything into English, even though English to half of the people who were there didn't make any sense, like sea urchin or sea bream or seaweed. It didn't even sound like food, right? but then nowadays it's all uni and Thai and Toro and Nori, and all the English-speaking people are quite happy to use Japanese words as borrowed words.
Yeah.
So it's like it used to be 100% domesticating, and now it's like more and more foreignizing. And is that the trend you find in Finland and maybe in that
Maybe
part
yes.
of the world?
I have looked at several translations into Finnish. Alice translations, and my favorite is Alice Martin. She's Alice as well, and we have discussed the story of Alice several times, and it is hard to say. The translations are all different based on the same original, which is interesting, and the illustrations in part as well, and. It is hard to say nowadays that when there's, here I'm looking at these two Alices, it is hard to say which Alice is correct one, which Alice is, but the translator might say to herself that I have, this Alice is mine, I have translated it. So it is, I don't take it as a violation of any rights or whatsoever. But not everyone thinks like me, but that's another story.
It's kind of similar to the way music is performed too. Music performance is kind of like translation, right? Every performer interprets the way a translator interprets the words on the page. And we don't always enjoy every performance. We may prefer one performer or one translator over another based on that person's interpretation. I think there are a lot of similarities between the two. Between the age of domestication and the current period, I think we had a kind of in-between period in literary translation where everything was explained. I feel like that was a big part. When I first started reading Japanese literature in English translation, they would explain Japanese words in kokoro, their sensei, the character sensei. They used, in the old translation, they didn't call him sensei, they called him teacher. In the next translation, they called him sensei, but they explained at the bottom, chūshaku irete, sensei means teacher in Japanese. いっぱいそういう footnotes がありました. We had a lot of footnotes like that. And now we've moved beyond that, as you said, and we just integrate those names or integrate specific words and accept them. It's more acceptable to do that now, and it's more welcome. Do you find a similar kind of trend in Finland, translating to Finnish?
Certainly, of course, when we think of texts like that have been dramatized for theatre, then it takes again change. Or there are shows programs on the radio we had before Christmas. The story of Alice was told and spoken, so that was again re-visualization and re-translation.
Yeah, another reinterpretation. Is there a reason why it was at Christmas? Is it considered a Christmas?
I think it was kind of considered
Interesting.
a Christmas story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know that it is in England or anywhere else. I don't know if anyone is familiar. It's not. It's my first time to hear of it referred to as being a holiday time tale. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, we have various theatre before Christmas for children in England, so probably not exactly associated with Alice. And we have Spirited Away.
Yes.
Right, right. That's true.
Which is not a Christmas story.
No, that's not it.
But yeah, close to Christmas
Right.
story.
Right.
Exactly.
But musicals okay.
Right.
And the thing you talked about manga being like all
Yeah.
flipped
Flipped
around.
around.
That happened in domestication age, right?
Yes,
I remember
yes,
seeing
yes.
all these books in
The
like
80s
Yeah,
and
Tower books
early
and stuff.
90s.
Right.
It started to change.
But then it wasn't the publication industry that felt the need to change. It was like pushed from like the ground up, right? Grassroots.
Mhm.
The readers, they were fed up with the fact that the publishers changing the direction of manga, and then people voiced, all their concerns, and then that's when the publication industry started using our format, because that's the manga format, and
Right.
so all these changes, like societal changes, really affect a translation in one way, right? It's maybe not what happens inside of a translator's head, but as a product, when the product is published, gets
The
affected.
outside forces sort
Right,
of
outside
forced
forces.
that change.
Right, exactly.
I'm not sure about mirroring the manga, but no one noticed the place where they put manga first. It was like children's
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
same
Oh,
in
yeah.
the bookstore, in the
We
library.
put together the picture book. There was like this motto,
Right.
Yes. So at the beginning, that's true. So
and it was for children to color.
yeah,
So true.
Japanese manga were sold. They put the Japanese manga translations with the ehon and the jidou bungaku section. But it's not for children. The content is quite adult, right? So it was rather there was a great misunderstanding about manga.
It's so funny.
Yeah.
We had this Bloomberg, we have a lot of books there, and there's like a huge children's corner, and we could see children, splashing colors over the Shiga Miyuku.
Oh no.
They thought it was Ruye.
That's like
Yeah.
R18 or something, right?
Yes,
It should be.
yes.
Children
One
should
of my
not
best
be.
memories of childhood.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Shocking.
Oh, it's written.
Shocking. But I think that because we have more globalization and more sharing of books and culture very easily around the world, it's much, the idea that the movement came from the readers is really not surprising, right? Because once they realize that manga is read this way, of course, they want something closer to the original, although there's no exact translation, as you mentioned. It's always a reinterpretation, but even so, they want it to be as close to the original as possible. Yeah.
And it's important to remember that very often the texts don't change, but the human beings change.
Yeah.
When, for example, I don't know how young I was when I read Alice's Adventures for the first time. And then later, when I was growing up, I reread it, and I noticed that I read it in a different manner because I myself had changed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, me too, me too. When I go back and read books that I read when I was a child, suddenly I have a very different perspective and the story sounds quite different to me. I did that just this summer when I went back to my hometown and I was going through my old books and reading some of those books I read in elementary school. Oh my goodness, my perspective has really changed. Yeah, it was pretty exciting, pretty interesting. Yeah.
About that perspective change, I guess it's not exactly on that point, but I've been thinking about manga and manga translation lately. And I believe there's another kind of translation that happens when you translate a manga, and that is translation of textual and or verbal and visual information into your own experience, type of experiential translation, for the lack of a better word. And what I'm thinking of is about bento. See, the bento was not known in most, part of the world, but then manga kept on picturing bento boxes and characters eating bento at lunchtime. And then, there are people who came from overseas and then lived in Japan, saw an opportunity to sell bento boxes online to to people in Europe or people in the States. And then they were, this person, Frenchman in Kyoto, started shipping out bento boxes into different parts of the world. And then people started, it sort of started getting traction, people started getting interested in bento. And then a few years later, exactly, we know, everybody knows what bento is now. But then that whole cultural shift started with manga and manga being translated. So that translated manga somehow changed people's experiences, and that I don't know. I've been sort of thinking about that these days.
And then how does the bento change when it's imported to other cultures?
Right.
Because I found a bento in my local supermarket when I went back to the States this summer. It's called Bento Go for kids. And it's quite, it looks like a bento box except it's plastic, but it has a section in the bottom for ice. So you put ice in first, the ice pack, and then on top of it is the layer for food. So they've changed the design a bit with built-in ice section, which I thought was quite interesting. But bento box, bento, is, it's become Americanized in this way. We have bento cakes now. We have what? Bento cakes. Bento cakes.
Yeah, we have bento cakes.
That's wild.
What's bento
What is
cake?
it? What is it?
What is it?
It is a cake for one person or two that you can take with you, for example, to your workplace, so you
Oh,
get a lot of stress and you're going to eat it along.
Oh, is that in the UK?
Yeah, it is in the cake.
Wow.
We have bento cakes.
Bento cakes. I've never heard of that.
Interesting.
And I'm not sure, I haven't read enough, but I wrote about bento in literary geographies, if you'd like to give it a try. There was a Miyuki Miyabe brave story, and there was this elder who packs the Wataru-kun, the protagonist, bento, and he said this is bento-ja. And it was translated as food for the road, because the bento in how English speakers perceive bento is something that your mother prepares to you. So he's an elder, he's not a mother, so this is a totally different genre. Although in Japanese language this is a lunch, this is some kind of a snack food for you, you can eat it with your fingers.
Oh, so interesting.
Yeah, we could go on and on. But I do want to, we have a few minutes left. I just want to make sure that the students have asked the questions they'd like to ask. Are there any other? Oh, I see a couple of hands. Yay. Christine, can you go first?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, right. That was very insightful and very interesting. It's a lot of inspiration for me as well, the talk that you gave. And I agree completely with translation being a dialogue. Mm-hmm. And I do also agree as a scholar and as a reader that, like academic-wise, that different interpretations is generally a good thing. But as a translator myself, like I am not, like when you said being uncomfortable with the source material and the target and the translated text being different, the part that makes me uncomfortable is not the fact that it has changed, but as a translator myself, I am not comfortable with claiming authorship in a way. Because when you mention like the different Alices, they are my Alice, or like in the movie version, there's Tim Burton's Alice, and there's a video game where it's like American McGee's Alice. There's all these different Alices, and I myself would have my own interpretation of Alice. And if I were to retranslate Alice into different medias, or say in my native language of Indonesian, I don't think I would be comfortable with saying like, this is my Alice, this is Christie's Alice. Like, how do you get over that feeling of?
Sometimes it's very hard.
Yeah.
I remember when I translated Hirakasu Opera's Pontapa, and it's a marvelous book. And I, during that process, when I was translating the words and then I was translating the images, I had this sense that in a way I wanted to get closer to the author and author illustrator. And then again I felt that my translation, even though I was in a way very faithful to the original, I felt that it was something that happens when you translate. I mean, you cannot say to yourself that I must translate this or this in a certain manner. But it comes gradually. And then when I finished that Konbanma, it's a lovely book and a lovely illustration, I discussed this process with my publisher. And she was of the opinion that it is a combination of the verbal and the visual, and the visual was so strong that I needed to translate the visual as well. And then again what happens? The translation becomes different. And so it is not a must that we have to decide that I'm going to translate this in this way, but it is, I don't know how to call it, but you understand what I mean. But it's a tough question, because I also translate. And actually every time I say that translation is different from the original, I mean it, but sometimes I'm uncomfortable when I say it aloud. But there are many different points of view. Yeah, you're quite right.
When I translate, I do want to give the experience of the original to a wider reader, right? But I want to make sure that they are experiencing the original author rather than experiencing me, because that's...
How will you know?
You can't avoid it!
But I just want to know, I just want to be able to at some point where know if, how do I say this? I want to be comfortable with, at what point am I being, because with the idea of translator's invisibility, how much is it that it's too much me is in front of the text? Are they, am I obscuring the original intent? That's what I'm scared of.
But how can you tell?
Yeah.
You never know.
That's true.
But it is probably your first time.
It's a good thing to keep in mind, to consider.
Translator's invisibility, in my opinion, is delusion.
It is.
It's just a delusion.
Because I have also written about translating for children, like picture books or many picture books I have translated. And every time I create the translation, I have this nagging feeling that is this what I want to say, how would the author say or illustrator say, and so on. I think about that a lot. But then again, I can say that translation is different from its original. Because the language changes and the culture changes and so on.
Thank you very much.
Do you also have a question?
多分ちょっと似てるのかなと思うんですけど、
はい
日本語でもいいですか？
Okay.
多分似てると思うんですけど、例えば英語から日本語に訳す本として、
直訳で英語から日本語に訳した後に日本語のなんか文章を作るのが上手だなって思う子にその日本語の文章をもっとその絵とかそういう日本に合うような文章を日本語から日本語に訳すみたいなことをした時にその子は原文を知らなかったら絶対原文に合った文章にならないと思うけれどもその文章としてはすごく仕上がりがいい。なんかそういうなんかでも原文を知らないから余計違う方向に走る可能性はあるっていう時にどこまでその原文を反映した方がいいのかそれでもいいのかっていうその
It's a very similar question. Yeah, it's a very similar question. So if she's translating a book from from English to Japanese,
Yeah.
she might first do a direct translation.
Yeah.
And if you were to read it, you would
Yeah.
say, this sounds like a translation. But then if it's rewritten to sound much more natural in Japanese, it becomes something else. And how far is too far to go in sounding like something else that's
Yeah.
far away, a little bit far away from that.
And it also has an influence that picture books are read aloud to children. So you need to, when you translate, you need to pay a lot of attention to the words and word choices and that they go together with the idea that you have of a certain book.
Would you agree that in children's literature in particular, especially talking about picture books,
Yeah.
every word is chosen very carefully for a reason? Of course, in a longer book, that's true too, but not to the extent that it is in a picture book. Every word was chosen for a reason, so I feel like it's important to understand the reason
Yeah.
and then translate properly.
And then again, you must remember that picture books are read aloud.
The picture books have what?
Picture books are read
Oh,
aloud.
read aloud,
Yeah.
sure.
And that has an influence, a great influence on what translated does with text. But it's very,
You wrote about that here, yes.
so it is, it's very hard to say. I don't, myself, I don't have the eternal truth, but that's how I think that translation is also alteration, which is the visualization, intervisualization, and so on. There are so many different factors, and what is important is that picture books, especially, are read aloud. That they how to say the sentence. But anyways, reading aloud is one important factor in addition to the other issues that we discussed. But it's a tough job.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a fabulous point to end on. We mustn't lose sight of what is the purpose of the picture book, and
Yeah.
that is to be read aloud and
Yeah.
experienced, not just read silently as we read,
Yeah.
as we would read an adult book, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. If we don't have any other questions, I'd like to wrap up for today. Is everyone okay? Well, let's give another warm round of applause for Professor Oittinen. Thank you so much.
Audience. I was looking at you when I was speaking in their faces.
I was so pleased to see so many students coming today. Thank you so much for coming. ありがとうございました。